Hello everybody. Thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Chris Collins. I'm the Integration Architect for QRadar, specializing in cloud integrations. Today we're going to talk about some of IBM's ability to bring data in from AWS into IBM Security QRadar and how both AWS and QRadar make that very easy to do. Today right now is the only slide I'm going to show you today around what we actually bring in. We're going to be doing mostly a demo. This just sort of shows some of the supported AWS services that we have for QRadar and some of the ways we can get them in. One of the things that's really nice about the strategy we've gone with QRadar is to have multiple ways of bringing data in so that you're not forced to fit the way you've deployed your AWS organization into what QRadar can collect, but rather QRadar can form itself to however you have configured it in AWS. This includes ways such as bringing in data from S3 buckets, CloudWatch logs, using SQS messages, or bringing in real-time data through a Kinesis data stream. Some of these lines are outlined here. I won't go into them in overall detail, but this slide will be available as part of the deck for you to have a look at. So let's start off by just doing a quick demo of how we would bring in data from one of the most crucial AWS services, which is AWS CloudTrail. CloudTrail is the audit record of everything that's happening in your account from the AWS side. So this includes creation of IAM users, starting and stopping of EC2 instances, modifications to permissions. All of these write operations by default are going to be logged in CloudTrail and then brought into QRadar. They provide excellent levels of detail for your investigations. They also will work in conjunction with security tools like GuardDuty in QRadar. So once you bring in that data, you may want to correlate the investigation from the GuardDuty finding into CloudTrail, and it's really important to have that data in QRadar. UBA can take advantage of it. Federated searches in different places can also find it. So it's a really crucial piece of data to be bringing in if you are using AWS and QRadar. So let's start by having a look at a trail that we already have configured. So I'm not going to get into creating a lot of the AWS resources, but I will walk through some of the steps here and show how they would be created and then how we would integrate them with QRadar. So this trail has already been created and is being logged to an S3 bucket. This is probably the most common method of having a trail logged to a bucket for auditing purposes. It's probably in your environment logging to a logging account. In this case here, this is just one development account, so it's all within the same account. So this trail is logging to a bucket and a folder for this account. So if we go to this trail log location, this will take us into the bucket where the files are. You have a normal folder structure of CloudTrail and then multiple regions underneath it. So Amazon's best practices for collecting from a bucket is to use an SQS queue as a event-driven architecture for notifications that new objects are available in the bucket. This can span from any level of depth from, in our case, we just have one account, but within this bucket, you could have multiple accounts. So when you configure these notifications, you can configure them for many different accounts or all of the accounts that live in the central logging bucket or specific accounts. So right now, these are being logged here. If we go down in with one of these folders, we can see that we've got some data from today. Great. So first thing you have to do is set up those object create notifications so that whenever new objects are added to the bucket, they land into an SQS queue. This queue does not contain the actual logs themselves. They're merely notifications that a new object is available to pull. So if we go to the bucket itself and go to properties, if we scroll down to event notifications, you will have to create one of these notifications. So I've already got one created, but I can show you what it looks like. So give it a logical name. And basically what you're doing is you're picking a folder suffix, a file suffix if you like, and you're saying, what do I want to be notified on? So you pick all object create events because we don't care whether they were put, post, or copied there. If they're newly created, we want to know about them. And then you only have to decide what folder do you want this on. So here, we're basically pulling the whole bucket. You would likely have a bucket that has multiple, so you may just start with AWS logs and CloudTrail or AWS logs and put a filter that matches CloudTrail. Here's where you would have it for the whole folder. So right now this bucket only contains CloudTrail logs, so I'm not even specifying a prefix, we're just pulling the entire bucket. Down here, we choose what to do with these notifications. So in this demo here, we're going to show sending the data to an SQS queue. I've already created this SQS queue ahead of time and chosen the ARN from the SQS panel. So if you go over to SQS and bring up that queue, it's going to want the ARN. This is also pickable. If we were to do it right from here, you can choose from your queues as well if you don't want to go get the ARN and go from that way as well. So these are very easy to publish. If you have multiple consumers of this data, such as other security tools or other ETL, then you can send to an SNS topic first instead, and then do SQS subscriptions to that queue, to that topic through the SNS and SQS panels. We won't cover that here, but that is a design pattern that does exist as well. So this object create notification is already set up, so I'm not going to modify it. So what happens is now every time a new object is written to the bucket, this queue gets a message. So if we go have a look at this queue, we can see I've set this up earlier. So there's actually 5,115 messages available. Every one of these messages is a pointer to a file that exists in a bucket, or an object that exists in a bucket. If we want to look at one of those looks like, they're pretty straightforward. They say, why was it created? Object put. There's a reference to a bucket name, and then there's a reference to a key. So the key is the folder or the object itself to go get. So these same queue can contain notifications from multiple buckets, from multiple folders, any combination that really works for you. So if you're an MSSP and you have multiple customers that you want to feed to the same, or you have a customer who spans multiple buckets, there's all sorts of combinations that you can decide in how you set up these queues for how you logically pull in data into QRadar. So now that we have CloudTrail set up and we have data going to a bucket and we have notifications going to an SQS queue, we're just about ready to start bringing data into QRadar. So let's go see what QRadar is going to want to set up a new log source for CloudTrail. So we're going to pick a CloudTrail log source. We're going to use the AWS S3 REST API, and then we're going to set the log source. Now, for active collection mechanisms, the log source identifier is just an identifier you can use for yourself. I'm going to call it CloudTrail demo. Now, authentication. This is a really great time to talk about the authentication methods that QRadar supports. So if you're collecting data from outside of AWS, meaning your QRadar deployment is not within AWS, you have to provide some sort of way to authenticate with AWS. So that would be access keys. These obviously should be rotated on a regular basis. They do provide a little bit of surface area for attack if they're ever exposed. So, it's not ideal to have to use access keys. If your QRadar hosts, either being a DLC, an event collector, a data gateway if you're on QRoC, or any of our other appliances, if they're located within the AWS infrastructure, you can actually do a keyless authentication method, which is what we would definitely recommend. So rather than picking access key and secret key, you would pick EC2 instance IAM role. What this does is this pulls a role off of the EC2 instance itself. So if we go look at the EC2 panel within here, and we go look at the server that we're looking at right now, there's a section for modify IAM role. So right now, this has an IAM role attached to it that allows assume role. So I'll get into details of what that role is currently allowing, but the idea is that by saying instance credentials, your EC2 instance or QRadar appliance can get the role that's assigned to it rather than having to provide credentials. So this is a great method of providing security without keys. So I'm going to say use your EC2 instance IAM role. So next we want to know how we want to collect the data. We'll use SQS event notifications, and it wants the SQS queue URL. So let's go back to our SQS panel. The queue we created earlier, the URL's right here. Go back here, put the URL in. Region name is the region that the bucket is in. We've been working in US East 1. And what type of data? We're collecting CloudTrail data, so in this case we select CloudTrail JSON. Different integrations will have different items, VPC flow logs, AWS network flow, so you would pick the appropriate type of data, or line by line if it's just regular one record of data per line in the file. So this is CloudTrail JSON, which has a JSON array of events that needs to be broken up into individual events, so we choose that. We don't need to touch anything else in here, so let's go ahead now and test our collection. So this test will actually actively reach out to the AWS API and try to do some tests to make sure that your log source configuration is valid. One of the great features here is that it's not just testing credentials, but it's also testing network connectivity and DNS and certificate connections. So we verified the DNS works. We've tested the TCP connection to make sure the port is open because maybe the firewall is not open to get to the endpoints that you want. And then we do an SSL handshake to make sure everything's good for the certificate. Where these are public endpoints, it's likely that the certificates are going to be fine, but it's still good to make sure that QRadar can communicate with it and see which TLS versions and cipher suites are being used. After that, we actually tried to connect to the Q URL, and we're seeing here that we're getting an error. So this error is saying the user provided has no access. The details of why the access has failed is in here. This can be backtraced into CloudTrail if one of your admins needs to search up why the access is not being allowed. But in this case here, I've given it EC2 instance credentials, but the role I've given it only has access to assume other roles. So in this role here, this allow assume role permission does not give sufficient permissions to the instance to actually talk to this SQSQ. So this would be common if you asked one of your cloud administrators to make you the permissions required as we document, and maybe they missed a permission, maybe there's a trust entity that's not quite right. But ultimately, QRadar has done a test and said permissions aren't there. So what I'm going to do now is use another great design pattern that exists and assume a role after I use my instance credentials. So instance credentials are now being used to authenticate with AWS, and then we're going to authorize by switching to an alternate role. So to assume a role, you need the ARN of the role. I'm going to go over here and grab my CloudTrail demo role. We'll grab the ARN from that. And then we'll put that in. So now we have a role. That's great. Let's run our test again. Looks good. So what's happened now is we've actually assumed the role instead, and there could be permissions issues with if your instance doesn't have access to assume the role, then this assume role test would fail as well. Another common problem would be not having all of the required permissions. So there's another one here that has the SQS permissions but not the S3 permissions. And what will happen here is we'll successfully access the queue, but then we'll fail to access the objects that the queue refers to. So, any combination of these permissions can cause you to have issues connecting. So the data we want to provide back is detailed and rich enough for you to be able to provide that data back to your cloud ops group to be able to help troubleshoot why QRadar can't connect. These test results are also downloadable. So any of the data that shows up here that on a failed test, you can download to a text file and then send that along with your data to your other group to help troubleshoot what the issue is. Now that we've talked to the queue, we've got some messages, and we've actually gone and pulled some messages from the files and shown some sample events. So these are events that are contained within the file that was referenced by this key here. So that's great. It looks like now we've verified that we have connectivity. We've connected to the queues themselves, which means our permissions are good. So authentication has succeeded as well as authorization. And now we've actually gone and got some data. So let's hit finish on this log source. And now that it's created, we're going to go deploy it. So we'll do deploy changes. And this will create this log source. Another great point around setting up permissions is making sure that your roles that you are creating are the least amount of permissions required. So they should only contain the required actions on the queues and the buckets. For example, on the SQS queue, you need to be able to read the message and delete the message to confirm it. On the bucket, you only need to be able to get object. You don't need list object, because since the queue provides access to the key directly, get object is the only S3 permission required. So that's great from that standpoint. We do document all the permissions required for each of these roles. So when you're creating these roles, we definitely recommend that you go ahead and provision them with the least amount of permissions, and ideally scope them to the resources that are required. Don't give access to every single queue in your environment to the QRadar role. Scope it to the queues that are required to collect the data. While we wait for that, we can go have a look at one of these other options that we have here. Another way to bring data into QRadar is through AWS Kinesis. So S3 buckets are probably the most common method of bringing data in, but they usually are slightly delayed in when they collect data. So to write objects to a bucket, you must aggregate data over time and then write it once on some sort of interval. So most CloudTrail data, for example, in S3 bucket is delayed by about 15 minutes and written every 5 minutes. So as soon as the data shows up in the bucket, this SQS queue will get a notification. QRadar will get it right away, but there might be a slight delay before you can get it. Now there's AWS Kinesis data streams allows for real-time data, meaning as soon as the data is available and routed through whatever event bus, QRadar can get it right away. So I did a quick demo earlier of bringing some data in through Kinesis through guard duty to have findings come in through that method there. And basically as soon as these sample events were created, within a minute or so, once it made it through the event bus, they showed up in QRadar. So having real-time data is a great way of bringing your security data in QRadar as well. Kinesis does have a slightly different cost than object storage, but it's really up to you to have a look at your different costs. But real-time data doesn't have to cost much more than storage, long-term storage. All right, let's see if our demo here is finished. So this is live data now that's coming in from that queue that we just created. And you can see it's just chewing through it there. Now, I created this queue yesterday, so it's going through the backlog of a lot of the data that was created. But once you're caught up, you'd be able to look. And if we look at this queue here, you'll be able to see that the amount of messages that are going in it are getting chewed through, and they're reducing. So if you do have a cloud ops group that's separate from your security group, and they know that QRadar is collecting from this queue, another good idea is to set up some CloudWatch alerts to watch for how many messages are available in these queues. Ideally, once QRadar is caught up, these queues should be mostly empty. So depending on how busy each queue is, there's probably a good threshold that you could use to decide whether, if I see a certain number of messages, maybe QRadar is either falling behind because of volume, or maybe it's just not being able to keep up, or maybe there's a problem where the role has been revoked, or for some reason QRadar can't connect. If this queue starts to climb, that could indicate an issue. We do have the ability to do some multi-threading by creating multiple log sources over multiple ECs to balance. So these SQS queues do support multiple consumers of the same data, and their in-flight and visibility methods allow to make sure that you don't end up duplicating data, but you actually share the load on the data. So this model fits really well with multi-threading and with being able to load balance the data and have some resiliency as well. If you have 3 or 4 consumers of the data and one of them goes away, you don't miss the data that one consumer was consuming. It'll just get picked up by the rest of them. So this design pattern is also really good for that. So that shows how we create a log source there. The testing framework that we have, as I mentioned before, is crucial and so helpful for being able to onboard your new log sources. As anything, there is a lot of steps required to set up new log sources, whether it be create the streams, whether it be create the permissions required, and any small errors in those can cause a lot of headache trying to onboard these log sources. So us providing you direct and pertinent information on what the exact issue was is so helpful for helping you and your security admins and your cloud admins troubleshoot the issue. So I hope you enjoyed this quick demo today. Obviously, there's a lot more than just CloudTrail. We have the ability to bring in AWS WAF, Security Hub, Guard Duty, Network Firewall. VPC Flow Logs is a great way to bring data into QRadar if you're licensed for Flow. That would actually show up in the Network Activity tab rather than the Log Activity tab. We may do a future webinar and show some more details on VPC Flow Logs. But that's all the time I have today. So thank you everybody for your time and enjoy the rest of the seminar.